Hey everybody, it's Travis coming at you with the first ever Tales from the Man Cave. I would just like to thank each of you for taking the time to listen to the show. Now, how did I come up with such a name as Rawbone Entertainment? You see, Rawbone was a creature that my Uncle Bud warned me about. He lived in the closet of the back bedroom at my grandparents' house. As I grew older, the legend of old Rawbone has never faded from my memory. You see, I was a good kid, but as a teenager, I was a holy terror. My parents did their best to keep me on the right path. They raised me in church, sent me to a private Christian school, and told me of God's love. Now, all the way up through the 8th grade, I was a perfect A and B student. But then it happened. I met my arch nemesis, Dave Zellers. He was a man of many hats. He was a teacher, a principal, and a youth minister. I spent most of my waking moments with that man. Now, I've always been the one to march to my own drum. I was a free thinker, a nonconformist, if you will. I never really acted out until I met him. You see, he was one of those good old Baptist boys. Everything was by the book, no room for deviation. He ruled with an iron fist. He was into Southern gospel and I was into rock and roll. I was introduced to rock and roll at a very early age. My brother Chad is 11 years older than I am, so when I was 6, he was moving away to Florida for college. Lucky for me, he left some of his cassette tapes behind. What are cassette tapes? Go ask your parents. Now, I cut my teeth on Motley Crue, Bon Jovi, and AC/DC. I was everything that Brother Dave despised. I think just my mere existence disgusted the man. One afternoon in a Bible class in the 8th grade, Dave called me up to his desk and handed me an issue of People magazine with Marilyn Manson on the cover. He was like, "Hey Travis, this guy's right up your alley, Bubba." I don't know why, but he always called me Bubba. I only had one brush with Manson a few months before. I saw the music video for The Beautiful People late at night on MTV. Yes, kids, MTV used to stand for music television. That video scared the living hell out of me, so when he suggested that I would be into this cat, I felt doomed. I was embarrassed and pissed that he would call me out in front of my classmates. I only had a few good friends at that school, Justin and Dwayne, God rest his soul. We were the three musketeers, misfits, and outcasts. Now, life in a Christian school was hard for the three of us. We were constantly getting in trouble and being singled out. Finally, my parents had had enough of the way I was being treated there. So halfway through my freshman year there, they decided to pull me out of there and put me into a public school. It was one of the happiest days of my life when they told me that I was going to transfer to Cott County High School. I have to admit I was a little bummed out when I figured out that I had to repeat the 9th grade, but no worries, I would soon be free. The rest of the school year was a breeze. I figured that since I had to repeat the 9th grade anyway, why try? I found out that Dwayne and Justin were also being transferred. So now going from a school of about 60 to a school of 1,200 was a little bit of a culture shock. Unfortunately, the three of us had had no classes together, so I found myself alone, and I was forced to make new friends. Everyone else had went to the same schools together and had their own cliques. Talk about a bummer. My parents weren't wealthy, so I didn't fit in with the rich kids. I wasn't a brainiac, so I didn't fit in there either. It wasn't long till I met my good friend Brian. He was into Nirvana and smoking pot. He was a real loner. I hadn't even so much as smoked a cigarette, but I found him cool, and I wanted to be just like him. He played music and so did I, so we had something in common. We started hanging out, and that's when my downward spiral began. I'll never forget the first time I smoked a cigarette. Who did I get it from? You guessed it. Now all you smokers out there, don't get your panties in a bunch. I'm not saying smoking a cigarette will turn you into a druggie or send you to hell. What I am saying is that I had such a desire to fit in somewhere that I adopted his lifestyle. He introduced me to some of his friends, and we just clicked. I finally had a group of friends that accepted me. Now fast forward to the summer of 2000. I was headed into the 10th grade. That was when I first tried weed for the first time. I didn't get high the first time I smoked it. It wasn't a few times till later that I really got stoned. It was the wildest feeling ever. I'm not saying that marijuana is addictive, but I've always had an addictive personality. If a little's good, a lot's better. So I found myself getting high a lot. It didn't become a real problem until the 11th grade. I was getting high before school and after school and sometimes during school. My English teacher told me in class once that I would be in rehab before the age of 21. Well, she was right. I became apathetic and my grades showed it. I was sleeping a lot in class and not turning in assignments. In just a few short years, I went from a B honor roll to straight Fs. I turned 18 in the 11th grade, so I figured what the hell. I was failing the grade and I didn't want to be a 20-year-old senior, so that's when I made one of the worst decisions of my life. I decided to get my GED, my good enough diploma. So in May of 2001, I got the hell out of Dodge. It wasn't long after that I graduated from pot to pills. I became addicted to Xanax and hydrocodone and alcohol. I was out of control. My parents finally had enough of my shenanigans and gave me the option to either go into an outpatient rehab facility or be kicked out of their house. So reluctantly, I decided to go to rehab. My teacher's voice rang in my head. I was the youngest person in that facility. Now, this was in September. I don't need to remind anyone what happened next. I'll never forget the 11th of September as long as I live. It wasn't long after that I told my parents that I would stop using if they would agree to pull me out of rehab. Things went smoothly for a while because I stopped hanging out with my so-called friends. Now, those of you who know me know that this didn't last long at all. Started hanging with the wrong crowd again and found myself back in the same old mess. I got arrested in October of that year for drunk driving. When I got my one free phone call, I didn't use it. I made the officer call my parents instead. Needless to say, they weren't too thrilled with being called at 2 a.m. with the news that their son was in jail. Dad refused to pay my bail, so I got a free night stay at the Cott County Jailhouse Annex. I went to court, got fined, but didn't get my license taken away. I didn't learn my lesson, I just learned not to get caught. So it wasn't long after that, my parents finally did kick me out. I found myself drifting from couch to couch, relative to relative. I had finally hit rock bottom, and not long after that I found myself getting clean and sober on my own. I had remained that way for a few years until my girlfriend of 3 years dumped me for another dude. I was devastated. I started to work at a haunted house in Gatlinburg. She worked at a museum down the street, so I had to see her every day. That made things very awkward. I found myself depressed, needing something to ease the pain, as they say, so I returned to my old ways of drinking and doing drugs again. It's taken me several years to get through my thick skull that drugs aren't the answer. They just make things worse. Now, I met my first wife at the job that I was working at. At first, it was just friends with benefits. Little did I know that she was a total psycho and would take me further into my depression. Oh, did I mention that I have bipolar disorder? I didn't learn my lesson from her, and I ended up believing the lies she put in my head that I was broken and that no one else would love me the way she did, yada yada yada. I ended up marrying this psycho, thinking that things would get better after we were married. Boy, was I ever wrong. Instead of getting better, they just got worse. In the spring of 2005, just 4 days before my birthday, my Uncle Bud, who was one of my best friends, and the one who told me of old Rawbone, shot and killed himself. I'll never forget the emptiness of my dad's voice on the phone when he called and told me the news. My best friend had just shot himself. I went numb. Fast forward a month or so, and my grandmother, Uncle Bud's mother, passed away from cancer. Now, this is a woman who had never smoked, chewed tobacco, or drank a day in her life. I tell you, cancer's a real bitch. Now, I know that they're in a better place now, but that didn't help me at the time. It was time to kick my addiction. They would have wanted it that way. So my wife and I had moved away to Maryville and found a church with a Celebrate Recovery group that met on Tuesday nights. I remained clean and sober for quite some time this time, and eventually my wife and I divorced, and I decided to go out for a drink to celebrate. That was another big mistake. I kicked the door to my alcoholism wide open again. I never returned to the pills, but I drank like a fish. Quite some time later, I met the mother of my child in Mississippi. What was I doing in Mississippi, you ask? I went down there with a friend whose wife was getting ready to be deployed to Iraq. I was just looking for something to poke, if you catch my drift. That was when I met Anna. She was in the same National Guard unit as my friend's wife, and as Tom Petty once said, I was introduced and we both started grooving. We hung out for a week and she went across the big pond for several months. We stayed in contact via Facebook, and when she came home, I invited her over to my buddy's house for a few drinks. One thing led to another, and well, I don't need to tell you what happened next. Several months later, on the 6th anniversary of my uncle's passing, we found out that we were having a baby. So we did what we thought was right and got married. On November 17th, I met my little baby girl. It was the happiest day of my life. Things were finally falling into place. I was happily married and had a beautiful daughter, and I was sober. A month went by, and we noticed that Izzy wasn't gaining weight like she should. We took her to a few doctors, and finally one suggested that we take her to Children's Hospital to have her tested for cystic fibrosis. We had no idea what that was, but he explained it to us. And we thought, nah, this couldn't happen to our daughter. Stuff like that only happens to other people. So in December, we took her to Children's Hospital, and they ran a sweat test to check for CF. It came back positive, and she had the disease. We were both shaken to the core. The shock finally went away, and then it turned to sadness. Then it progressed to anger and bitterness. I was angry at everything. I was angry at God. I resented parents who had healthy children. Anna and I moved back to Newport to where my parents lived so we could have some help raising her. I'm telling you, my parents have hearts of gold. They let us live there until we got back on our feet. Time went by, and Anna and I started drifting apart, and eventually we became just like roommates passing in the hallway. We decided that we should get divorced. We had been separated for over 2 years before Beth and I got together. Who's Beth? She's my last wife. Before you all freak out, we had dated in high school and were crazy about each other. Things just didn't happen the way that we thought they should have. Now, the story has a happy ending. We started dating, and her and my daughter became like best of friends. Now we're married. I'm 6 months in, and I'm happier than ever, not to mention I'm clean and sober. I finally have someone who supports and encourages me. She's the best thing that's ever happened to Izzy and I. Now, I have no idea why I felt the need to tell you all of this, but here I am to tell you that fairy tales do come true. Anyway, to wrap this up, old Rawbone lives.